Making a board game can be really tough, and often you're tempted to just give up on a game when it's not working. But you never really know when a great game might be hiding just around the corner. You don't want to give up before you find it. In today's video, I want to tell the story about how I almost gave up on what would become my most successful game, Next Station London, and what I learned from the experience that can hopefully help you not give up before you make a great game. Hi, I'm Matthew Dunstan. I'm a board game designer based in Australia, and to date I've published over 60 games all around the world in various languages. On this channel I like to talk about all things game design, talking about my experiences in the industry, and giving you tips and tricks to become better designers yourself. In this video I'm not going to go over how Next Station London works. I'll leave a link to a video up here which you can watch and then come back to hear the rest of the story about how the game developed. So let's set the stage. It's February in 2020, and of course I didn't know that the world was about to change, and not because I was going to design a great board game. I started working on the game that would become Next Station London. I was inspired by my love of public transport and the London Underground, and video games like Mini Metro to make a game about building your own underground network. And I had a twist that I'd already thought of at the very start, which was that you could draw different lines on your underground network using different coloured pencils. Each round you'd use a different colour, and that would mean you would draw a different line in every round. And at the end of the game, hopefully you'd end up with a sheet that would look just like the London Underground map, which I thought would be really cool. Just like in games like Mini Metro, initially I started with a prototype which was all about connecting passengers who were trying to go to particular stations in the city. Here you can see the first map that I made for the very first prototype I made in February of 2020. The idea was that you had a grid, you'd be drawing lines that would represent the underground lines themselves on the dotted line of the map. You would cross over the river, you can see the Thames in the middle there. You had the homes where passengers lived, which were the small shapes, and then you had the bigger, darker shapes, which were the buildings they were trying to get to for work every day. I also had these symbols in each corner, which were sort of bonus objectives where you were trying to connect two of the same shape, the two blue hexagons to each other, or the two yellow stars to each other, to get an extra set of points at the end if you managed to make that very long connection from either side of the city. From the very start, the game was a flip and fill game, and it ended up being that way. But the game started a little bit differently if you know where Next Station ended up. It started with this idea of drawing lines in particular directions. So in the initial map, I'd marked the edges of the map, north, south, east and west, and the card showed drawing lines in those cardinal directions. So for example, if you drew this card for the round, then you get to draw 3 line sections in a north-south direction. Or maybe this card here, you get to draw 2 sections, but in any of the major cardinal directions, north, south, east or west. Or maybe you'd only be able to draw 1 section of your line, but you could draw it in any direction. There are also cards that gave you stations, which would allow you to pick up and drop people off. You would have to put them next to the various places on the map. You also had these bus terminals, which you could place on empty spaces, which would give you bonus points on particular lines. And the scoring was essentially multiplicative. It was how many passengers you could transport to how many different buildings of that type. If this is your first time watching my channel, you might be surprised at how basic my prototyping is, but the main thing I'm just making sure at this very early stage is that the prototype is readable and functional rather than particularly beautiful. I also don't have a lot of graphical design skills, so this is what you're stuck with. So that was my first prototype, and it worked okay. The core idea of using coloured pencils to draw the different metro lines on the map was a lot of fun, and it looked cool, even with a very dodgy looking prototype at the start. But as is the case with a lot of first prototypes, there was a lot of room for improvement. The system that I had for the cards with the directions was as confusing as it was restrictive. Often you'd want to go in particular directions the cards wouldn't let you, and often you would make mistakes drawing lines in the wrong direction without even thinking about it. So that was the start of the game, and I thought it was a reasonable start, and it gave me a bit of energy to keep going with the game. But what would follow would be 5 months trying 12 different distinct prototypes, and nothing really working, nothing quite gelling and providing the experience I really wanted. In the second map, I moved to using dice instead of cards, and these dice would determine how many sections you could build with a track. The problem with this, though, was that you had to remember all these different options for the dice, which made the game a bit clunky. When you would roll the dice, you'd have to look at a table to figure out what they meant, and it was a bit too heavy for the type of game I was looking for. The next few iterations were very small changes, trying to tweak what the dice were doing, to maybe make the game a bit more flexible and a little more free-flowing. I would change what a 1 would mean, or a 3. But there was nothing much more than that. Fast forward to May and we're on the 6th prototype now. You can see I've made a bit of a change of the graphics of the prototype. I've introduced these different building types to make it a little less abstract, but still the idea is that you're delivering people from a particular place to a matching building type. And in this version I was using a dice drafting system with the idea that you would roll a number of dice at the start of the round and then select dice as you wanted to build different sections on your map. but of course this made the game longer, and you still had the problem of having to look up every time you roll the dice to work out what the die actually meant. Just a few weeks later, and I changed the game again. This time, I suddenly gave every line its own budget, so you had a certain amount of money that you could use on each line, and you would draw 2 cards from a deck every round, and choose one to do, and every card had a cost on it. So the idea was you would be trying to choose which action you really wanted at the time, but you had to be careful not to spend too much money over the course of the round, otherwise you would run out of actions near the end. And again, this didn't quite work. It was another complication on a system, and it still had the problem that it was too restrictive and that you couldn't make the connections you really wanted to when you wanted to. So the game felt quite unfulfilling. In the next main iteration near the end of May, I got rid of all those costs on the cards, and now you were just directly choosing from 2 cards on a turn and doing the action on one of them. And this worked pretty well actually. It had the flexibility that you could always do something on your turn. You didn't have any of these problems with not being able to go in particular directions. It was fairly straightforward to follow, and I followed it up with 2 more iterations fairly quickly in the next few weeks, where I was effectively refining the types of actions in that deck, making them interesting, and getting them down to a suitable core of actions that were enough to make the game interesting. I also introduced goals in the game, and goals had come in and out of the game at various stages of the prototype, and these were rewarding you for doing particular things, like connecting to other lines or connecting opposite points on the map. Fairly standard goal stuff for a map game. In this latest prototype, near the end of June of 2020, I made the first change graphically that I'd done for a while to try and simplify it. I got rid of all the grid lines that had been on previous maps and instead just went for the dots that you were joining with either straight or diagonal lines. As you can see, this is getting closer to what Next Station London looks like, but still the game was functioning with these action cards which you would select from between 2 on every turn. And the game was fine. It functioned pretty well. I'd done a lot of work making the actions simpler and more easy to follow to make the overall game experience an easier one and a more enjoyable one for my playtesters, or so they said. But the problem was, at the same time, the game was just fine. It didn't really live up to this promise that I felt when I first had the idea of using the different coloured pencils. And it didn't quite create the visual map that I was imagining at the end of the game. It was still a bit too cluttered with all these parks, and I had these blank stations that you would draw into during the game, which was a bit difficult because people would draw in different ways, and that could make the end result look a bit messy. And so at this point, after about 11 or 12 iterations, I'd got to a stable version of the game, but I wasn't happy. It wasn't something that felt done, it wasn't something that I really wanted to pitch to another publisher, and so at this point, I almost gave up on it. I stuck it on a shelf, and I thought about other things. Also, as you would all know, this is the middle of 2020, and we all had other things to be thinking of at that time. And I could have just given up at that point and never touched the game again, but then I would have never made the very next iteration of the prototype. This file is from the 17th of July 2020, about a month since the last prototype I made, which I showed, which was just fine and not particularly inspiring. And here, suddenly, can you see a game which looks very similar to what Next Station London would become. Gone are all the complicated draw-in shapes and the parks and things that make the map look cluttered, and instead we just have a sea of shapes on a point grid. And if I scroll down to the cards, gone are the actions on the cards, and all we have are simple shapes on cards, and these branch cards that would be later renamed switches. I changed the clunky system of these different actions on the cards to one simple rule. Flip over a card on your turn and draw a straight line connecting directly to a station matching the shape on the card. This was it. This was the core mechanism of Next Station London. I wish I had a great story about how I arrived at this change, but really it was just a random thought that had popped in my head one day when I hadn't been thinking about the game for several weeks. It was still driven by simplifying the game, but this really large change turned out to be exactly what the game needed. And once I made this change, well, the game was actually pretty much done, and it didn't change that much on its way to becoming published. And as they say, the rest is history. The game would go on to be published by Blue Orange in 2022, and then be nominated for the Spiel des Jahres, the German Game of the Year, one of the biggest board game awards in the world, in 2023. And while it might not have won, it's certainly one of my best-selling games, and has spawned a couple of sequels, Next Station Tokyo and Next Station Paris, and a really popular online implementation over on Board Game Arena. The game has a bunch of fans from all around the world, and I'm so grateful for how they've received the game and the love that they keep giving it even today, 3 years after it's been released. So, all's well that ends well, right? I think there are 5 main lessons which you can take away and apply to your own game designing. The first lesson is, when working on a game, you never really know when you're going to have a breakthrough. As this video is titled, don't give up. If you give up, then you're definitely not going to have a breakthrough. Just not giving up is not really enough, because just because you keep working on a game doesn't mean you're going to suddenly have a bolt from the blue and have the thought that's going to fix the game and make it work well. You have to pair the idea of not giving up with the idea of not being afraid to shelve an idea. I put Next Station on a shelf for about a month before I had the final breakthrough that would make the game what it is today. And similarly for yourself, if you're really hitting a wall or you're at a point where you don't quite know what to do with the game, don't be worried. Put it on a shelf. Don't force it. Don't try and force the game to be great if you don't have that thought to make it better. And this follows on to lesson 2. Trust your gut when it comes to working out whether you should keep working on an idea or at least keep it alive on a shelf somewhere. I knew in my gut when I was working on the game that the core idea of using these different coloured pencils to represent the lines was a really good one. It was so visual, intuitive, and fun. And so even though I was having trouble with the game and it had settled into this fine state, I knew that there was a great game in there somewhere. And that really helped me make the decision to not give up on it. You're not going to finish every game that you work on, and you're not necessarily going to make a great game from every idea that you have. But I think it's best to trust your gut whether an idea is worth holding on to and to keep working on it if you can. But at least to leave it on a shelf rather than throwing it in a bin. Don't get me wrong, don't take away from this video that you should work on every game and that every game will become brilliant if only you spend enough time on it. The trick is trusting yourself as to which games to spend the most effort on and which games to leave behind and work on new things. Lesson number 3. If as you're working on a game trying to make it better, you end up making it more complicated, usually this is a sign that you're moving in the wrong direction. This is often called design by addition. The way you try and fix a problem in a design is by adding more and more components, more rules, more edge cases to cover that problem and try and improve it. But in my experience, and certainly in the experience of designing Next Station London, adding more things wasn't the way of improving the game. Yes, I could always add new systems and then refine them and try and make them more simple, but that initial addition of new complexity could never be erased. The moment where you introduce a new mechanism, for example when I added money and this idea of budgeting the different lines and different costs on cards, suddenly the thing you introduce to try and solve a previous problem only adds more problems to be solved to your design. On the flip side, when I went through that final big change in my game, it actually simplified it, and that's a very good clue that that iteration is moving in the right direction. It did away with all these clunky actions on the cards, and I could replace it with a single shape on each card that was easy to understand with one rule that covered all the cards as they would come out in a round. Lesson number 4, and I've taken this one from Reiner Knizia, who I think has said it in a lot of interviews, and that is look for solutions that solve multiple problems at once. Really, a lot of the changes and iterations that I made in the game, up to the point where I made the big breakthrough, weren't really changing a lot of things. They were merely trying to streamline what I already had, or add a little bit more flexibility in the game. But they didn't necessarily solve a lot of problems with the overall flexibility the players needed, nor with the game being a little bit too hard to learn, in that every time you rolled a die or drew a card, you had to look up what action you were doing. When I had the breakthrough in the game, it solved multiple problems at once. One, it made the game much easier to understand because you had one rule that covered every card that could be drawn on a turn. In that, the rule was that you just simply connected to a station with a straight line that matched the shape that you drew. Number 2, it gave players a more limited decision space, which actually made the game a much better puzzle and reduced overall analysis paralysis. In previous versions of the game, even in the best case of the previous version, it was still a little too freeform. The game told you how many sections you could draw on your line, but didn't restrict you as to where you could draw them. And when you're given 8 different directions every time to extend a line, you're giving players too big of a decision space to try and work out every turn what they're going to do. And the game wasn't meant to be that complicated. And for a puzzle to be satisfying, you really have to be able to understand each option that you could make. And if you have so many options, there's no way that you can determine the relative strengths and weaknesses of each when making a decision. With the new system, it was very quick to figure out on your turn the 2 or 3 different stations you could connect to. And then you could look at each of them and make a decision. And that improved that feeling of puzzliness and making a good choice every turn. And finally, it made the game much visually simpler. Now, instead of on the map having lots of different symbols, you had 4 shapes on the nodes, and that was it. And of course, when Maxime Morin, the artist of Next Station London, got involved, the game looked a whole lot better and even clearer than my dodgy prototype. And the last lesson I have, maybe one of the most important lessons from this whole process, is don't settle for fine. There are so many games being made these days that you don't need another okay game. If you want to make a splash in the market, if you want to have a game that players are going to play over and over again and that will sell many copies, You need a great game. And trust me, you'll know when a game is great when it is. Trust your gut when you have a game which is just fine. Be honest with yourself. It can be really difficult to say that sometimes. You might have been working on the game for months or even years, and it can feel like you've wasted so much time if you get to the end of that and you go, well, that's fine. And it can be even harder to convince yourself to keep working on the game at that point. But believe me, when you make that step change, the change that suddenly moves everything in the right direction and increases the quality of the game tenfold, then you know you've made the right decision, and you know that that iteration is a step in the right direction, or several steps. So again, be honest with yourself about how good the game really is and whether it really needs more work. Is it great or is it just fine? And related to this is sometimes you just might not be able to crack a game, you might not be able to find its great state, or maybe it can't exist in the current iteration of the game. And that's okay, not every idea is destined for greatness. As I said earlier in the video, give yourself the freedom to stop working on a game if it's not working. Don't feel like you have to bash your head on against a wall and try and solve it just because you've put a lot of hours into the game already. Becoming a better game designer is not about never stopping designing one particular game, but rather never stopping designing altogether. The one definite way for you to fail as a game designer is for you to give up on the craft altogether. But choosing to stop working on a particular game isn't a failure. In fact, sometimes it's a very courageous thing to do. So be honest with yourself and give yourself the freedom to stop working on a particular design if it's just not working. Hopefully some of my experiences in designing Next Station London and the subsequent success of the game might be useful for you in some of the projects you're currently working on. If you're working on a game right now, I'd love to hear from you. Are you stuck? Have you just made a change that suddenly moved everything in the right direction? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love this channel to be a great place where we can support each other on our game designing journeys. But until next time, thanks very much for watching and all the best with your designing. Bye.